an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Wizards at War, Chapter 9. In this chapter, our friends manage to escape from the bug planet, and they do a little bit of research, and they're being blocked from finding out much of anything. Only thing they really do find out is that these bugs are like literal avatars of the Lone One. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Patricia for commissioning this episode. Patricia is out here in the chat, and glad that you could make it. So this section, I said this in the little blurb that I wrote when I posted the link for this episode today. But I found this extremely interesting in that when you read a lot of fiction about the apocalypse, you know, where they're like, either it's happened already or we're trying to avoid one, it's always sort of like lots of what it tends to be is lots of innocent people get sort of caught up in the unfortunate consequences of poor choices, poor uses of power, and that can be literal power or figurative power. And thus the world begins to fall apart as we know it. And that can be like a societal thing, or it can be like actual people dying and it turns like, you know, if we have a zombie apocalypse, it can be a health thing so that there's a huge population reduction. Or it can just be basically like the world being sort of almost leveled and having to start over at creating a new society and like structure of living within whatever changes have happened, whether it's sort of a radioactive thing or, you know. And in all of those sort of apocalyptic scenarios, the impression that you get in a lot of that fiction is that human beings are still who they've always been. And the apocalypse feels sort of circumstantial to the fact that we are often the point of setting something in a post-apocalyptic world. That is set up so as to investigate what human beings are like when the trappings of society are removed. And a lot of times what they are like is pretty much exactly what they're like now, which is there are some people who want what's best for everybody and are self-sacrificing and care. And then there are people who are power-hungry, sadistic maniacs. And then you've got a lot of people in between. Russia, which is the name of the planet that my little crew of scrappy friends has just escaped from, this is, in my opinion, the most devastating apocalypse scenario I have ever read about. Because this is much more than a bunch of people who may not have had anything to do with the events leading up to whatever caused the eventual destruction of society or humanity or the planet. These are beings that are actual embodiments of a being of entropy and destruction and death and decay. Everybody on this planet is, or at least every one of these like bug-like creatures, is a straight up representative for this being. And for me, I don't know, obviously, whether or not this is something that is occurring because they chose it, because it feels like they had to have chosen it. That's not to say that people can't be overshadowed as wizards against their will. I mean, nobody wants to be overshadowed, but what we've been told is essentially that a wizard sort of has to compromise themselves on a level that they may not be completely saying, yeah, come on in, lone one, but they are aware they're dancing on the edges of what's like allowed and okay. And so to a degree, you could say they are making that choice, and that's how the lone one gets in. So I have to assume on this planet, we have achieved that with every being. And it's not just that they're overshadowed. It's not even like that simple. Overshadowed, there's a sense of, okay, well, we could potentially still save them from themselves. And it's not like that here. And yet, the planet is still alive and occupied, and there is still like a building of a society going on. And I feel like that's what's so upsetting for me, is like, it's one thing for the entire population of a planet to be like taken over by sheer evil. But when you imagine that, a lot of us, I think, our next assumption would be, okay, well, if that were to happen, those beings who are bent on destruction and evil will just basically kill the world, right? Wipe themselves out somehow. There is something so much worse about continuing on in a sort of organized way. I don't really know how to explain my feeling on this other than like, I desperately want to know what their cities look like. And yet I'm also afraid to see it, because the thing about the lone one that I find really odd is that it's not actually, how to say this? The lone one doesn't seem to be sadistic in a way that I'm used to seeing portrayed. When you use that word, it tends to be like, I want to see you be tortured in front of me, you know? And when I say tortured, I mean like a physical torture, you know? But what the lone one enjoys is a sort of psychological torture. We saw this at the end of the last book, where it managed to trick Nita and Kit into following it down in a place where, if it weren't for Punch, they couldn't have gotten out. They would be trapped there for eternity because these beings had made like a weird choice. And the lone one's sole comfort in having been turned away from this planet would be watching them for eternity, realizing their mistake. I want to see what a being like that, who enjoys seeing that kind of thing, I want to know what a city would look like built by that being, but I don't want to go to it. Does that make sense? I want to be told in an overview sort of way with bullet points what that contains, without having to see it from the perspective of a character who is experiencing it, because I feel like that's going to be awful. And also, if the lone one gets off on that kind of psychological torture, and all of these beings are avatars of itself, who is it torturing? The trees, I guess? Any other life forms, I suppose, on the planet? I mean, I suppose that's it, right? Other life forms, just for the sake of it. Because we don't, like, that must be when Nita puts her hand on a tree in the last chapter. She says something about how the tree was in fear of something worse than the mere physical destruction happening around it. And so I'm assuming that means the tree is in fear of getting sort of taken by the lone one because it's aware of what's happening. But I don't know that for sure. And I just, I can't overstate, you guys, how different this is. This whole situation just feels alien in a way that makes sense, I suppose. But I'm going to read this part here. So they find out the world's name is Rasha. And there is something really interesting about all of the information contained in that name. Let's see. Over the image of Rasha in Kit's manual and across it in Scarrett's view of his own, a string of bold-faced characters burned in the speech. They said, Areshhav, an acronym for a much longer phrase, and one rarely seen because few worlds were so completely dominated by the Lone One to qualify for its use. Areshhav implied lost, a place almost as much lost to hope as to the powers of darkness, and presumed to be beyond redemption until the powers that be should intervene directly. The term also implied that the intervention might possibly be fatal for the world's inhabitants if the Lone One could not be otherwise dislodged. Yikes. Like, this is grim. This is grim in a way that feels so like it's not. This is not to say we haven't seen in this book and every other property out there somebody who gets, sort of overpowered, but maybe they get possessed or they get put in a situation where essentially they need to be redeemed. And sometimes that redemption adds up to their death. Sometimes they are redeemed because they sacrifice themselves in this final moment. But what this sounds like to me is not it says the intervention might possibly be fatal for the world's inhabitants, not the redemption, the intervention. So they could potentially, in the act of trying to help and save them, they could be killed. Just the act of it, not and it won't succeed, and they'll just die anyway. And I would argue that's still probably better, than being a fucking avatar for the lone power. But it's very easy to say that from where I'm sitting. Rasha was the fourth world out from its sun, at about the same distance Jupiter would have been in Earth's solar system. The other three planets were much too close to Rasha's ferocious blue-white O-type star for even life's endless inventiveness to do much with. Those worlds weren't much more than the little scorched moon-sized rocks, their sun signs repeatedly slagged down by flare activity. So then we get some interesting details about Rasha's history in terms of its landscape, which you wouldn't think it'd be as interesting as it is, but I found this very compelling. Rasha had been distant enough to keep its atmosphere through the flares. Afterward, the plant life that had come to cover the world had slowly exhaled enough gases to breed a greenhouse effect, which allowed other life to evolve there. Millions of years had produced a planet where the vast march of the ruthless, struggling rainforest was broken only by tar pits thousands of miles wide, slicked over with lakes of oozing oil. The last remnant of far more ancient forests, killed by solar flares and transformed by heat and dead weight over thousands of millennia. The turbulent weather was as unforgiving as its sun. Summers hot enough to melt Earth's polar caps alternated with winters that were simply one long, supremely violent hurricane. Wow, that sucks. And it says that most of the living species are plants. There were very few flying and creeping species with no intelligence to speak of. And of these, only the ravenous top flyers were tough enough to survive Sek's awful burning light for long. These infested the uppermost levels of the rainforest that covered the two great continents, eating one another and anything else foolish enough to venture up or out into the terrible fire of day. So this is a kind of a wild planet because I feel like I'm really used to, in fiction, the suggestion that every other planet is as diverse in its life forms as Earth is. You know, we've got, I don't even know how many millions of different species of plant and animal. And it's really interesting to see a planet that has so little going on. You know, there's like a handful of different creatures that can stay alive on it, and that's kind of it. Which, it does feel sort of Star Wars. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the that franchise, that incredibly famous, ubiquitous franchise. But there is a whole thing in Star Wars where practically every planet seems to have its own, like, singular climate, and that's it. So we've got, like, snow planet and forest planet. And this has that vibe for me a little bit. So they're looking at the map from on top, and Nita, she's, like, investigating as much as she can. And it turns out that the giant bugs call themselves the Yaldiv, and Nita says they don't really think of themselves as separate entities, though. They seem to see themselves as different parts of, like, one giant whole, not a them and it. Some of the species' background information is blocked. Data in abeyance, and then a lined out passage which says data withheld. And that is a really, like, I didn't know that was even allowed. It's one thing to feel like, okay, so our manuals aren't necessarily safe from the lone one, which I already have said how I didn't know that was even possible for the manuals to get hacked, basically, and how uncomfortable I am with that whole concept. But this, the manual getting hacked so that the lone one can hide information from you? Excuse me? How is that allowed? I didn't, like, how? Genuinely. The lone one just has this power that I think we don't really see it get to flex its muscles all that often. And so I haven't asked whether certain things are possible because I have a very comfortable boundary in my head, this, like, concept of where its power ends. And it's totally made of assumption. There's nothing in that I can point to as being evidence. I just thought certain things were off limits and that was it. Nope, evidently not. So Nita says, let's get down there and find out what the instrumentality is and what we have to do to get it and make it work for us. And Philip is looking at Ronan, really the being inside Ronan, and is like, so can you give us any fucking more information than this, since the lone one has decided to interfere with what we get to know? And Ronan says, well, the being is basically like the powers that be seem to think we've got as much information as we need. And when Kit expresses frustration with that, the power is like, I don't know why you're upset. This is how it's been. And you guys have always managed to, like, give us the results we needed before. Which is sort of a weird... This is like the kind of thing that happens when you, like, work somewhere and you're really good at your job. And then your reward for that is just being given more responsibilities. You know? At least with those sorts of things, you tend to get, like, a promotion. Maybe you get a pay increase. But here it's just higher and higher level crises, which that sucks. So let's see. Nita says, probably we should start with the cities. There are 2 city hives on the bigger of the 2 continents, like giant anthills. They're a few hundred miles apart. They've been fighting each other on and off for, Nita looked at the numbers on the timeline indicator, millions of years? They must really be enjoying it, Scarrett said dryly, which I really did like that line a lot. Scarrett just keeps coming through for me with like lines that I find pretty funny, like very understated, dry humor. And it's really, I'm enjoying that a lot. So the whole thing is each of them sees the other as a terrible threat. Each of the Yaldiv cities always saw itself as the only being in the world. And then all of a sudden another one turned up that thought of itself as the only being in the world. I mean, this feels like an incredibly simplified version of all human conflict in history. Right? Like, it's just that's what it comes down to when you really look at any of the disagreements that major communities have had with each other, is like, our way is the way. Do it our way. If you don't do it our way, then die. Because our way. That's it. And that can be any kind of thing. It can be look like us. It can be give to us. It can be worship the God we worship, like any number of things. But what it comes down to is always the belief that whatever group you're with, you are the group that deserves to survive and be. And there's something about it being boiled down to this weird conflict with these that's going on for millions of years that I'm like, yeah, that's actually, like, when it comes down to it, that's really all it is the fundamental belief, like, well, you shouldn't really exist. Like, if you're going to be more like me, then you can exist because that's like kind of just more of me. But if you're not going to be more of me, then nah. So both sides have a great reason to panic and an excuse to wipe out the other. And Kit looks at the radiation. And apparently it is supposed to be that they used weapons against one another, which Philip, just as the sweet little summer child that he is like, are you kidding me? Are they using atomics? Next you'll be telling me they burn their hydrocarbons. And I'm like, Philip, you figured out that everybody on Earth were herbivores. Or at least omnivores. Did you not figure out that they burn their hydrocarbons? Like, I feel like the way he's saying this isn't ironic in the way that it would be if he knew, you know, where he'd be winking at them like, wow, they're really fucked up, kind of like you guys, am I right? And that's not Philip's personality. He doesn't like to make little snide remarks. He's not sarcastic about things. So I don't really know how he missed that, but evidently he doesn't know. And Kit and Nita don't say it. They just are sort of like, this isn't as unusual as you seem to think it is, bud. And that's sort of all it comes down to. The rest of the history section is blocked out. And here's something else that's kind of nasty, Ronan said, glancing back at the group. All these creatures have got a significant aware fraction of the lone power as part of their souls. And when Nita says overshadowed, the champion says avatars. No, it's permanent. Rather more permanent. All of them are mortal versions of the lone one? How is that possible? And Scarrett is like, that would take so much power. And the champion's like, yeah. And the lone one is immensely powerful. Like, that's its whole thing. So yeah, it absolutely can do this. However, it would be really difficult. Like, it would be a significant outlay of power is how he puts it. My guess is that this culture has either been owned for so long that this kind of avataric presence has simply seeped into the species nature over millennia, or else the manifestation is something new, a test bed for something the lone power is planning. The test bed for something new? I don't care for that at all. And I mean, it's been millions of years, so it's obviously like it feels like this has to be a test of something that's greater. And I was like, is this related to the Pululus? I feel like that's how she says it in the audiobook. I listened to the audiobook today because I kept saying Pululus. And I think she says it differently in the audiobook. And later on, Doreen shows up and is kind of like not thinking that the Pululus is actually the thing they should be focusing on, which I thought was I don't really understand fully, and I'll read it with you guys and just like go over that a little bit later. So basically what it comes down to is that they have to get back down to the planet, and they have to figure out what the instrumentality is. And Nina's already kind of like, and what do we do with it when we find it? And yada, yada. And I think Scarrett is the one who says to basically stop worrying about things that are 8 steps ahead. And let's just focus on finding the damn thing first. And also Nita asks about how it saw through her invisibility spell. And Ronan says the lone one can break a working wizardry when it's directly present. It was party to wizardry's creation, so it can easily interfere if it's got a local foothold in a willing soul. That's what avatars are all about. They can be worked through a lot more effectively than the merely overshadowed. But did that avatar recognize us as wizards? Kit said. Probably not, said the champion. No, sorry, possibly not. Very different from probably. Avatars don't have to be conscious of their status. So eventually the champion, they like go down and they check out the overall landscape, and they find this cave that is going to be a place for them to hole up. And obviously they need to stay the fuck out of that sun because they will just get cooked. And Nita at this point is talking about how she needs to give her dad a call because she's worrying about the time thing still. So here comes something that I really was so upset by. She calls and there's no answer. And she calls his cell. There's no answer. She calls Tom and Carl and there's no answer. I don't love this. And it could be nothing. You know, it could be just a upsetting sort of coincidence. But I don't think that's what it's going to be. And Nita has this really strong feeling that there's something that she's supposed to be doing. I think that has to be coming from somewhere. But there is something so sinister about, like, it's one thing for our senior wizards to just be depowered. It's another thing to not know where any authority figures are, including her father, who isn't a wizard at all. That, combined with how absolutely powerless they are to find out what's going on unless they go back to the planet, it just feels like at least they can go back and they don't just have to sit there and wonder what the fuck is going on. But what this sort of reminded me of, to be honest, was like back in the 90s as a kid, even as a teenager, you couldn't find somebody calling them at home. Good luck figuring out what was going on with them. You know, they were supposed to meet you somewhere. Are they on their way? Did they forget? Did they go somewhere else? No idea. It just, there is something about not having a way to, that he has a cell phone, but he's not answering it. So like, what good does that do? And I was like, man, I really wish that probably there is something you could set up, but I'm thinking of like, you guys know those things, tile that you can buy and you attach them to different, like, very high priced items that you like travel with. You could put them on your iPad or your laptop or your car keys. And they basically give off a signal, a Bluetooth signal, that when you go into an app, it'll show you where that signal is. If you lose your keys, you can just go into the app, and if the tile is attached, you can find your keys. I wish that Nita could do that with her dad, with like a wizardry, so that she could just look on a map and be like, okay, he's here, you know, and just see where he, like, I feel like as long as you could see where he is, that would probably explain enough. Not necessarily always, but if she could at least just see that he's at work, you know, maybe shit's going down at work, but at least you know that, like, he hasn't died or been kidnapped or something, God knows. I really don't know what this story would do with her father either. That's another thing that's sort of interesting me, is that in other stories of this kind, we would have beings kidnapping loved ones and a lot of like very personal drama. And these books never really go that way. It's always much more, not to say that there aren't physical altercations and whatnot, but the physical altercations always feel a lot more symbolic, you know? And I just don't know if this is a book where the author will change that and be like, okay, well, everything so far has been very symbolic. Let's get real now. I mean, even the Polulus is pretty symbolic. And I don't want to use the word passive, but that's like the closest thing I can think of. It's a weird kind of threat that you can't go and have a fist fight with and be done, you know? So this is when she really begins to freak out, and she has to talk to Kit about the fact that she wants to go home and find out what's going on. And Kit's anxious about it. He doesn't like that they just got here and she's already heading back. And they have this sort of interesting conversation about Ronan. And he says something to her about how she kissed Ronan. So it turns out he did know, because I was really curious whether or not she had ever said anything to him. It turns out she didn't say anything to him. He just like overheard it, so to speak, because of their mental connection that they have as wizards. So there is this like knowledge that he gets from just the impressions in her mind, or like the emotions that she's feeling at the time, that can't be helped, which I find really frustrating. You know, like I am somebody who values my privacy, and even with somebody that I'm really close to, them always being able to like know things about me without me being able to necessarily control that. I don't love that, you know, and Nita obviously is a little bit disturbed by it. And there's just the conversation between the two of them is odd. It's a little awkward because Kit didn't even want to like it. He wanted to have this conversation with her overall because of how weird she's been around Ronan and try and suss out what she's feeling. But he can tell once they start talking that he's on very like shaky ground and kind of wants to back off from the conversation pretty quickly. And how that conversation wraps is basically her talking about Carmela and how she's into Ronan, and Kit realizing that Carmela is going to have to like deal with a weird champion of all good inside a potential new boyfriend. And she has no idea that's even a thing. And Kit just starts cracking up hysterically. And I'm going to jump back a little bit because I kind of jumped forward with the phone call thing because that's just been so on my mind. This author is just so good at cultivating a sense of dread. And it's kind of funny because like the dread that I felt in the last book, when it comes right down to it, was unwarranted. It turns out the situation wasn't the kind of dire that I was feeling it was from all of the weird instances surrounding Ala'alu and their traveling there and people's reaction to telling them they were going there. But it was still really effective in the moment. I was sincerely worried. And I can't help but wonder if it's going to turn out to be something similar here, because I have such dread around the fact that her father's not answering, Tom and Carl aren't answering. And I might be totally overreacting, but she's really good at giving me just enough that I can then start to extrapolate all of these scenarios in my head that aren't even fully crystallized ideas. It's just vague, like, oh God, and lets me simmer off by myself while she constructs the rest of the story. So anyway, I wanted to talk about that phone call thing because it was just like it was high impact for me. But I'm going to back up here. Let's see. What do we do when we find the instrumentality? Just take it? What if it's something that belongs to the Yaldiv? What if they don't want to let us have it, or they won't tell us how it works? I've got to be honest, you guys. They keep talking about the instrumentality. I don't actually know what they mean by that. Did I miss a really clear explanation of what the instrumentality is? Because they're basically talking about it as if it's the answer to the Polulus issue. And I feel like I have to be misunderstanding that. They're sort of behaving as if something on this planet can either stop this dark matter from being created, or it is creating it and it can be turned off. Am I misunderstanding what this means to them? Because I've been paying pretty close attention, and I feel like I skipped a page, or just didn't really absorb the full meaning of a conversation somewhere along the way. So this is when Scarrett says, we've got to go down and do some research. I can set up short-range transits for us from here to the surface in such a way that they ought to be undetectable. But what then? We're going to have to walk places. We're going to have to go into Yaldiv cities and pass unnoticed. And as you say, the usual invisibility doesn't seem to be enough. These creatures, the warrior foragers anyway, have a better than usual sense of smell, as well as what looks like an innate sensitivity to force fields. Merely visual disguises aren't going to do the job. And this is when Philip decides to shine. Yamaz in the chat says, I don't know. After you started, I noticed I did not listen to this chapter yet. Oh no, I'm spoiling you. It's all right. I read so much out of directly. I want to address that also. I do read excerpts in Spoil Me in general when I'm covering books, but I feel that in terms of overall quoting compared to discussion, I do a lot more quoting directly from the book with this series than I do with any others. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that things are so symbolic, and that a lot of this is there are a lot of info dumps in these books. And it's interesting because usually when you talk about info dumps, there's an implication to that the writing isn't good or that it's done lazily. And I don't feel that way at all. But there is so much dense information in every segment of these stories that I don't feel like I can gloss over it, because it winds up a lot of the time being pretty important later. There are some stories where you get given a lot of info and it turns out broad strokes are really all you needed. And the extra info can be fun and it can add either flavor or dimension, but it wasn't crucial. And in this series, I feel like it tends to be continuously important, and plus there's just certain turns of phrase and whatnot that I feel like have to be said in directly quoted. I don't feel like paraphrasing is really going to do the job. Let's see. Mordecai says, Dwayne has an entire language and philosophy. Yeah, 100%. And, with things like this, the instrumentality, I also want to quote this directly because I feel like I missed something. And I want to read the exact wording over again while I'm talking about it in order to see if it shakes anything loose with my memory or, an interpretation that I hadn't thought of. So this is, Phyllis says there's nothing, this is proof there is no such thing as coincidence. Have a look at this. A moment later, Kit found himself looking at another Nita. He glanced over at the original one. Her jaw had dropped. And it turns out that he can copy her voice. There's an implication that he can even copy her scent. And so this is not a merely visual, as Garrett had said, disguise. Halfway between a seeming and a full shape change. It's less likely to leave you with the side effects that a complete change would, yet it looks and feels solid. It'll pass all the common sensory tests: touch, smell, taste. I started work on this when I didn't want to look, sound, or smell too much like a vegetable in a world full of herbivores. And this is when he basically says the thing that I said in the last book, because, it was weird to me that Doreen was going to such extents to hide the fact that they ate plants from Philip, when I was like, Philip isn't an idiot. They, all of you know that different beings exist who eat different things, and there are different types of sentience. He would, if you explain it, he'll understand. Why are you being such a weirdo about it? And that's basically what Philip says, is just oh yeah, I went and researched you and just began to realize you were built to eat plants, and your plants aren't the same as the plants on my planet. And just all of that, it could have been sidestepped, but I think it was just sort of played up for comedic effect in the moment. But there is a part of me that feels like it made Philip look more innocent and clueless than he actually is. I feel like it had an effect on me as a reader of infantilizing him a little bit. Is that the way you pronounce that word? Infantilizing. And now that he's got this kind of rad power that's going to low-key save the day, at least he's got more participation in the story in a way that feels really key. And we have, when we're in Kit's perspective, Kit's thinking about how Philip has just been a really hardworking wizard. But this, I'm just sort of interested in the fact that this was never dealt with earlier. So he turns into Carmela at one point, and Kit does this huge exaggerated no. And Nita's no wonder she spends so much time bugging you. You give her these huge reactions. If you didn't make such a fuss, she wouldn't have nearly so much fun. That's true, by the way. Not to say bullies are justified. If you just don't react, bullies will leave you alone. Because that's not true. But when you're dealing with somebody who is a sibling who tends to be more sort of teasing rather than harmful, I feel like that's true. So, since it looks like the Yaldiv are diurnal, a lot of them go out of the city to work in the forest in the daytime, then come back when it starts to get dark. We'll go back in with them. And I really like that at one point, I think this is Scarrett, he talks about how he's going to loop their entry point so that the scent doesn't give them away, where they're actually coming from won't be part of the scent profile, I suppose. Which it never occurred to me that basically having a doorway open to a whole other planet to a degree would probably give you away if these were beings that either saw it or could smell it. So this, oh my God, I forgot that in that conversation with Nita, she says that Ronan's 1,000,000 years older than me. And Kit has to be he's 2 years older than you. Nita looked less exasperated and more befuddled. Basically, he's trying to push her to be do you still have feelings for him? Why are you being so weird about it? And I thought that it was he doesn't actually really get to the point. He doesn't actually ask her that. But I do feel a little bit better about him generally. If I was feeling a little paranoid about him, maybe it was left over from the last time someone I trusted was being overshadowed by the lone one. It's not like Ronan can be overshadowed while he's got the one's champion inside him. As far as we know, Kit said, but a lot of things aren't working the way they usually do. And I was like, oh, don't. Kit, don't. Don't do that. Don't even put that out there. And that basically is Nita's reaction also. So let's see. Oh my God, too. Kit also mentions Helena, his other sister, and how she still believes that he like made a deal with the devil. And I had forgotten that it was like that extreme. You know, I was thinking that she just like doesn't really approve, but I didn't remember that it was that kind of intense like disapproval that borders on believing that you're a genuinely like evil person. And that's really awful. So Ronan comes back, they found this cave, and they head down there after Nita makes her phone call and realizes that she's going to have to go home and figure out what's going on with her dad. And Philip, Scarrett, wants to go down with her. I'm trying to find the spot where he explains why, because I can't remember what his, let's see. I can coach you on how to compensate for any equivalent lag now that we know how much of it we're dealing with. It'd make sense to take that information back to the crossings. It'll help my Sibs keep things running there for a little longer. That's what it is. So they both, like, right now, our crew doesn't have any plans to take direct action quite yet. They're still, like, gathering information. So it seems like a fair deal for these two to go off and do a different thing right now. And Nita, like, Kit's, like, asking her, so there's something going on with Tom and Carl as well. You're, like, not telling me everything. And she says, I still feel like we've run out on our seniors, and they probably got worried about us when they came looking for us and couldn't find us anywhere. I'm not going to tell them anything, but they need to know we're okay. And he's like, yeah, that's still not it. And a feeling is all it is. I wish I had something more concrete to go on than a hunch, but that's all I've got. There's something back that way that needs doing, and I have to go there and find out what it is and do it. And I hate acting like being on Rashad is freaking me out enough to make me immediately run away. And Kit reassures her he knows that's not what it is. She sort of challenges that, but in the end, he's like, no, I know that's not what it is. So they take off, and the rest of them go down to the cave. Philip turns Kit into a giant bug. And it's really like the idea of being in a cave in this place. There's something very like frightening about that because of how many things have to go underground to survive. The only thing that sort of reassures me is how few species there seem to be here. And it just makes me feel like they're backed into a corner, even though I know that's not true because they have like literal magic to create wormholes to get the fuck out. So let's see. He went after Paunch, popped open a can of dog food, and emptied it into one of the waiting bowls. I love this. He asks Paunch, like, he says, we're going to go down and get into this cave, and then I'll feed you dinner. And then he sort of, like, makes fun of Paunch for it being all about food and playing. And Paunch is like, that's not all there is. There's also squirrels. Excuse me. Have a little bit of respect. And I was like, Paunch, please never change, bud. He's so great. I love Paunch so much. So there's a main trail from the city hive that passes not too far from here, Philip said. We can make our way easily enough to it from our transit point. Since these creatures are so scent sensitive, we should put the outside end of the transit wizardry in a little loop that leads from the path and goes back to it, so that it won't be obvious to any Yeldiv stumbling on it that our trail goes only so far and stops. And this is when Philip starts to like do all of these wizardries. The green fire construct stayed anchored in the air and grew upward and outward, becoming more and more complex every minute. It resolved into the big oval shape of a Yaldiv's body, spreading outward into the legs and claws, the light then filling the innards of the shape as it sketched itself on the air. Shortly, the shape of a complete Yaldiv hung there, resting lightly on its walking claws, towering over Philip and Kit. That sounds so unnerving to see. Like, it sounds like it would be beautiful, but also the end result is looking like one of these fucking low-key demonic creatures. And they don't seem too flipped out about it, but I feel like after the encounter they just had, if I were one of them, even if I know that's Kit, I would still be like, oh, I hate looking at this thing, you know? And none of them seems to have that sort of reaction, which surprised me a little bit. I took the template from the Yaldiv that Ronan had to blast, Philip said. Poor creature, it had little enough time to serve life, even as crookedly as it did. Now it will serve another way, which is such a compassionate way to look at it. I just genuinely, Philip, you're just too good for this world. So in the midst of this, there is this like huge sound that causes all of them to completely like hit the ceiling, think they're maybe being attacked. And it turns out that it's Darine. Let's see. They stared at Kit. Darine actually squinted. Oh, on you that looks good. How'd you find us so fast? Ronan said. We didn't even know we were coming here till a little while ago. I got Nita's message when we popped out of transit on our way in. She left a pointer to the new coordinates and forwarded it to the transits Scarrett built for you. But where'd she go? And they have to explain to her what's going on, that nobody can get a hold of her dad. Darine says something about how we've got bigger fish to fry, and Rashawn's like doesn't know that this is an idiom. So he's like, why are you talking about food right now? And I thought that she would like sort of mock him for not knowing what she meant, but instead she just rolls with it and is like, yeah, I'm very hungry actually. She reached into her other space and started feeling around. We found out what we're supposed to be looking for. The instrumentality? What is it? Not a what, a who. And it's funny that not even you know, she said, munching. She has a little like granola bar. Since your passenger was carrying the information, but then not even he knew, did you? She said to the champion. And he admits, indeed, not only did he not know, but that as far as he's aware, nobody has ever made him a carrier for information without him being aware of it before. Which, that feels like kind of alarming to me. That this has never happened. Like, this thing has been extant for most of the existence of the universe, is my understanding. Not even the universe, like the universe as, like, life. And this has never happened? What? And what? That's scary to me. I don't know. Is that just me? So, the instrumentality is the Hesper, or a Hesper. And she says it in this way. I'm like, am I supposed to know what that is? Like, I couldn't tell if there is a word that gets used in one of the opening chapters that they ask what it means and nobody knows. And I look it up and I couldn't find out what it meant because it was an invented word. I don't think this is it because this is so distinct that I feel like I'd remember this, but, Ronan has a distinct reaction, looks at her very sharply, but others, they don't seem to know what she means by this. So she says it's a made-up word. We don't have an English equivalent. And then she starts talking about names for the lone one before it fell. Hesperus, which was one of the names of the evening star. So some people started using Hesperus as the name for the lone one before it fell. That's the closest word we've got for what we're looking for. What's about to happen is the emergence of a bright version of the lone power. All we have to do now is figure out who it is, where it is, and how to help it. I genuinely don't even know what a bright version of the lone power even means. Because that sounds like a good thing. Like, when you say bright, that sounds like something that's positive. And so when she says we've got to find out where it is and help it, she doesn't say like put a stop to it or anything. Yeah, I don't even like, I don't understand this. And when Kit mentions the Poyulus again, don't you get it? That's not even slightly important compared to this. I think the powers are trying to tell us that doing the right thing about the Hesper will save the universe too. The Hesper's a lot more important, and we've got exactly one chance to get this right. She stood there and waved her hands in the air. Kit realized he was seeing a historic thing happen. Words had just failed Dareen. The thought scared Kit almost worse than the Poyulus did. And that's how chapter 9 ends. So, yeah, a bright version of the lone power, and it's forming somewhere, like in a person, like the way she says it, it sounds as if it's like a being that's about to take a person over, or I don't understand anything about this. Mordecai says, so like the lone power before falling. So that it is a good thing. So basically the concept being that if this thing manifests, it's going to be a counterpoint, I assume. That's interesting. 'Cause I kind of thought that the lone powers were like meant to be, the powers that be were meant to be the counterpoint. What would that even look like? And this is also weird too, because like we know that the lone power has been like convinced to stop doing this shit, but it's still got parts of itself out there actively bent on mayhem. So that also adds a weird element to this whole thing. Mordecai says, yeah, but what if a good thing manifested on that planet, or at least if something that powerful was on that planet? Well, considering that it's been said that maybe they'll be killed by something trying to intervene, yeah, I feel like that could be real bad. And who, like, where would it even... I have so many questions. And I want to know also how Dareen exactly figured this. Like, she had this data, but what did it look like, and how did she figure out what Hesper was? I want a little bit more background on like her putting those puzzle pieces together. It just feels a little abrupt to me, and like I'm supposed to have more of a reaction to it than I did because I didn't understand. It's not really explained very well, you know, like, I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I just like, I didn't find the ending of this chapter to be as high impact as it feels like it was meant to be. Because of the lone power, so to speak, if there's a bright because the lone power fell, sorry, I'm trying to decipher this. Because the lone power fell, so to speak, if there's a bright version being made, but stays in that planet, I don't know what, you're saying this, Patricia, with an ellipses at the end, like I'm supposed to be able to infer if this, then that. I have no idea what happens if it doesn't fall. Like, I genuinely don't have any sort of answer to that. Coverage point ellipses, not in inference. Conversation. Sorry, guys. Patricia is trying to type, but her phone is not cooperating with her. I don't know. I want this to like be more important to me. And I feel like I'm spending too much time trying to figure it out. But maybe the next chapter will fill in a lot of gaps for me. And also the thing with the instrumentality, I don't feel like I understand that either. So it just feels like in a lot of parts of this story, I am at a bit of a loss. And I feel like I'm losing track of what the characters are trying to do and what they're aiming for a little bit. And I haven't really felt like that in these books before. There have been times where I feel like we've been dancing on that boundary a little bit, where I start to be like, am I about to lose the thread? But I feel like here I'm really starting to lose it. But I'm just going to like have to wait and see, you know, I mean, maybe it'll all sort of shake out and it'll be explained. The next episode isn't until December 17th because I will be going on vacation. So, I hope that you guys don't miss me too much. But I am excited that the next episode is commissioned already. So yeah, I'm going to wrap this one up, but, thank you again, Patricia, for commissioning this one. Hope that you guys are enjoying the coverage, even if I haven't been super, like on my shit with understanding what's going on, but I'm doing my best, and hopefully I'm not alone in struggling with this a little bit. And I'd be interested in hearing from people about it. All right, everybody. I'm going to wrap. Thank you again so much. Until next time. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.